For those of you still signing in, please put your location in the chat.
So see, we have a lot of folks from Florida. That's awesome, but a lot of people from other parts too, which is really nice. Ooh, right back.
Okay, let's get started. More people will trickle in, but let's keep the time. We'll get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on how to spot and report injured manatees. My name is Tiare Frederick, and I'm Save the Manatee Club's manatee biologist. I'm here today with my two colleagues who will introduce themselves. Kim.
I'm Kim Dinkins. I'm Save the Manatee Club's Senior Conservation Associate. We are going to get everything started soon, but wanted to let you know that if you have questions throughout our presentation, we're going to be using the Q&A function. At the top of your screen, you'll see that to the left of the three dots. You're welcome to chat here, but our questions and answers will be done and facilitated through that Q&A function. And then we'll be, again, recording this and publishing it to our website, so you'll get a notification when that's available as well. My colleague, Cora Burcham, will be presenting tonight. She is our Multimedia Director and Research Associate. She'll be doing the talk, and then Tiare and I will be helping out with those questions as needed. So, Cora?
All right, awesome. Well, thanks for the introduction. I'm Cora. So I will be talking tonight about how to spot and report sick and injured manatees. So this is our first webinar we're doing. So thanks everyone for coming. I see we have a lot of folks from Florida and also some from other parts of the country. So yeah, so let's get started. Oops, there we go. All right, so just a quick overview of sort of the rundown of the presentation. We'll do a really brief introduction about manatees. Then I'm going to highlight a couple of threats that manatees are facing, basically in preparation of, you know, what's normal, what's not normal, what may you be seeing, and then, you know, what to do about it. And also some tips on how you can help. And then we're really going to get into the main part of the presentation, which is how to spot and sick and injured manatees and how to report them. And then at the end, like Kim and Tiare already said, we're going to do a Q&A. So again, you can put your questions into the Q&A box, and then we will be addressing those at the very end. So the Florida manatee is a large, slow-moving marine mammal. And they can live in a variety of aquatic habitats. So you may find them in brackish water, salt water, and fresh water, and they can go back and forth between those. So you may see them in shallow coastal areas, you may see them in rivers, estuaries, you may see them in lakes, as long as those lakes are connected to some other sort of waterway. And of course, then you'll also see them at the freshwater springs, especially right now that it's starting to get a little bit colder. Manatees are generalist herbivores, which means they're vegetarians. They only eat plants. And in addition to seagrasses and submerged aquatic vegetation, they also eat some floating plants, such as hydrilla. Well, hydrilla is a submerged plant, but water hyacinth, water lettuce, alligator weed, you know, those kind of things. They do migrate seasonally. So right now, we're actually right at the beginning of their winter migration, where the manatees are moving back to their warm water sites. So while in the summertime, we really see manatees more dispersed around Florida, as well as in neighboring states, such as Alabama, Louisiana, or up the East Coast in Georgia and the Carolinas. In the wintertime, they really come back to Florida because that's where the warm water is. Right now, there is an estimate about 6,000 manatees in Florida. This is determined by so-called synoptic surveys. And over the last couple of years, when they did the surveys, we always came out with about 6,000 manatees. They are protected federally and statewide. And that is under the Endangered Species Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, as well as the Florida Manatee Sanctuary Act. So in 2017, they were actually downlisted by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service from endangered to the threatened status. And this was basically based on the growing numbers of manatees. So if you're looking back when the counts first began in like the 1970s, they counted maybe between 1,200 and 1,500 manatees. And like I just pointed out, right now, they've pretty consistently seen around 6,000 manatees. So while this definitely sounds like a big increase, which it is, it's really important to keep in mind that manatees were actually never listed as an endangered species due to the low numbers, but because of the threats that they were facing. And as you'll see in the course of this presentation, the threats that manatees are facing unfortunately have increased over time. So while 6,000 manatees may sound like a pretty good, robust number, if you're looking at how many manatees are dying every year, that number suddenly doesn't seem so large anymore. So this year, as most of you may have heard, we've had unprecedented manatee mortalities. As of November 5th, there were 997 manatees recorded that had passed away. And therefore, this year was an unusual mortality event was declared at the beginning of the year. And unfortunately, we are pretty much close to hitting those 1,000 manatees that have died, which is really a number that nobody wanted to ever see. And if you're looking at 1,000 manatees dying per year, having 6,000 manatees total really is not that big of a number, especially because manatees are very slowly reproducing. They usually only have 1 or 2 calves at a time, usually 1. Twins are very rare, and they do take care of those calves for up to 2 years. So if they're experiencing a really big loss to the population, it's not something that they can make up for, very quickly. So it's something to keep in mind. And then in addition to the mortalities, 131 manatees were also rescued this year, which is really, it's a record number as well. So while we oftentimes hear about the mortalities, it's really important to also realize how many manatees were rescued and are being rehabilitated right now. So manatees actually have no natural predators. They can be seen in the vicinity of alligators and sharks. They do share the same habitat, but there's usually no aggression between the two species. Actually, those 2 pictures you see on this slide here were taken at Blue Springs State Park. And you see manatees and alligators in very close vicinity, very close proximity. And it's usually the manatees actually that annoy the alligators. There's a juvenile manatee that's sort of climbing on the alligator's tail over there, and then the alligator just swam away. So no natural predators at all, but they are a threatened species. So now I want to go over some of the major threats that they're facing. So the number 1 threat, human-related cause of death for manatees is collision with watercraft. This is the largest known cause of human-related manatee mortality. And most living manatees in Florida bear scars from these encounters with boats. As you can see here in this picture, this is actually Manatee Alice from Blue Spring. She has a big series of scars over here, and most manatees bear scars from those collisions. So in 2021, we had at least 89 fatalities due to watercraft, and this is where the cause of death is known. Unfortunately, if you're looking at the statistics, a lot of manatees this year and last year were not necropsied, meaning no autopsy was conducted on the animal. So we don't really know why they died. So a lot of those manatees that are either were not necropsied or where a cause of death could not be determined could potentially be attributed to watercraft as well. So just a brief note, manatees, they do hear boats, they can hear them, but oftentimes they're just not able to move out of the way fast enough from a fast speeding boat. So that's why the number 1 thing we can do is go slow in manatee habitat. Something else to really keep in mind is that 60% of manatee mortalities by watercraft collisions are actually caused by the impact trauma from a fast speeding boat. And then the rest, 40%, are caused by the propeller. So I put this little graphic in here, which I personally really like to sort of illustrate the anatomy of a manatee. And if you're looking here at let me see if my pointer here is working, at this red part over here, which basically extends all the way from their shoulder area down towards their tail, this is the manatee lung. So you can see they have very large lungs. And anytime they get hit by a boat anywhere here on their back, what can happen is that they can break a rib, which can then potentially puncture a lung. So that can be really dangerous for the manatee in multiple ways. Oops, now I went this way. All right, so what can we do about this? First, like I already said, going slow in manatee habitat is really the number 1 thing we can do. Obeying, posted speed zones, going slow if you're boating anywhere where manatees could be found. Wearing polarized sunglasses, this is a really good idea, not just if you're boating, also if you're right now going to any of the natural springs or power plants. Those polarized sunglasses really reduce the glare in the water. So it's a lot easier to sort of see through the water and see manatees. So not just if you're boating, I recommend having them for whatever activity you're doing out there if you're hoping to see something. Also looking out for manatee snouts and footprints. So what do I mean by saying a footprint, right? Manatees don't have feet. If you're looking at the picture here on the left-hand side, you see these circular patterns on top of the water. And this is what the manatee makes with its tail when it's swimming. So we call it a manatee footprint. So if you see something like this is a very good indication that there is a manatee around. And like I'm going to go over in the next couple of slides, when we talk about how to report sick and injured manatees, this is the number you would want to call. This is the FWC number, and I'm going to have that on many more slides. This is really the number that you should have, and that's where you report sick and injured manatees. And then last but not least, Save the Manatee Club does provide free materials such as dock signs, decals, waterway cards, boater packets, free of charge. I put an example here. This is one of our decals. And these are really great to have if you're boating, kayaking, if you live by the water. So you can order them from our website, and I'll tell you at the very end how to do that. So another threat that manatees are facing is entanglement. A lot of manatees get entangled in monofilament line, crab traps, and other debris. So as you can see here in this picture up here, this is actually Manatee Una from Blue Spring, and she had her flippers very severely entangled in monofilament line, which led to actually 2 rescues, and she eventually lost half of her flippers. So a good indication that you don't want to have that in the waterway. And then here on the bottom slide, this is a manatee that actually got entangled in a bicycle tire, also showed up at Blue Spring. Again, a very good reminder that any trash in the environment can become really dangerous to manatees and other wildlife as well. So we want to make sure to discard fishing line in these designated bins. You may find them pretty much at any boat ramp in Florida and surrounding states. That's where the fishing line is supposed to go in, so it doesn't end up in the waterways. And then if you do see an entangled manatee, it's really important to report that to the FWC and not try to remove or cut off the entanglement yourself. Oftentimes we have situations where a manatee is entangled in a crab trap. So you'll see the floating ball of the crab trap sort of on top of the water, and people tend to cut that off. But that's really not removing the entire entanglement. It's just removing that floating ball on top. And that makes it really, really difficult for biologists to then come out and relocate that manatee. So that's one of the reasons why you really shouldn't be cutting that off yourself. Another reason is oftentimes it is really so deeply embedded that these manatees need medical attention. So they don't just need the line removed and cut off. They really need to come in for care to have that medically cleared. So best thing to do is to report it and then have a trained biologist look out for it. Just a really brief slide here on manatee tracking, because a lot of people get sort of confused about what a tracking device looks like and what is an entanglement. So unfortunately, we do have some folks that have accidentally cut off these tracking devices thinking that they're helping the manatee because they think it's entangled. So as you can see here in those 2 pictures, these tracking devices consist of a belt which goes around the peduncle area here. This is where the tail connects to the body. And then a 3 to 4 foot long tether actually connects the belt and the tracking device, which over here floats on the surface. And it can also submerge with the manatee. And this equipment includes anything sonar, VHF, satellite transmitters, a GPS, a temperature recorder, all those kind of things, so that researchers can monitor those manatees, especially if those are manatees that were rescued as orphans and then released. They want to make sure that those manatees are adapting to life back in the wild, that they're doing well, and this technology allows that. It is designed to come off if the manatee gets entangled, so it has several weak links. So if the manatee gets tangled on something, it just have to slightly pull, and then the whole thing will come off, which does happen quite a bit. And this is also something you can report to the FWC. It's oftentimes good for them to know where the tagged manatees are. Sometimes this equipment will malfunction or it stops working. So it's always good to call them in, and then FWC can pass that information on. So another threat manatees are facing is loss of warm water habitat and cold stress. This is especially something right now in the winter time that we want to look out for. So like I said, manatees, they migrate seasonally. So right now they're migrating back to their winter homes, which can be natural springs or power plants. As you can see here, this is at the Tico power plant over in Apollo Beach. However, these some of the older power plants are being retired in the future, and there's currently no real contingency plans in place on what to do with all these manatees that migrate to these power plants, how to sort of wean them off of those power plants. Another issue is that a lot of the food sources in the vicinity of those power plants are really diminished, like we're seeing right now on the Atlantic coast, particularly in the Indian River Lagoon, where manatees are migrating to these warm water sites, and then there really isn't any food for them in those areas. So they have to make the tough choice whether they're going to stay at those power plants and stay warm and forego feeding and then potentially starve, or if they're leaving the power plants, exposing themselves to really cold temperatures to try to find food. Manatees also have a very, very high site fidelity, which means they're really migrating back to those same warm water habitats year after year after year, and the mothers teach their calves to do that. So weaning them off from one side and trying to, make them go to another site is not all that easy. And then we have the natural springs, which face their own threats. One problem is the reduced spring flow due to overpumping and the withdrawal of groundwater for human consumption, and also loss of springs due to development. So those are really things that we need to work on as well to protect these warm water sites for manatees, especially those natural ones, as we may see an increase of manatees that have to use those in the future once they're no longer able to use these artificial warm water sites. So the magic number here is sort of the 68 degrees Fahrenheit, 20 degrees Celsius. This is usually when they're starting to migrate back to these warm water habitats. Then the next thing for manatees that's an issue is what we call harmful algae blooms. So I don't want to go into too much detail just because this is a very complex and complicated topic, but I do want to bring it up because we've been experiencing some pretty severe algae blooms here in Florida. And algae blooms usually occur when that algae sort of gets out of control. And this is mostly related to pollution by nutrient runoff, such as runoff fertilizers, leaking septic tanks, sewer systems that are not working correctly, stormwater runoff, all those kind of things that end up in the waterway. And then they can really fuel these algae blooms. So there's different types of harmful algae blooms. For example, red tides, brown tide, blue-green algae. You can see here on the right-hand side over here, this is a blue-green algae bloom. This photo was taken at Port St. Lucie back in 2016. And those usually occur in fresh water. And like I said, increased nutrients can fuel these algae blooms, which then really cover the seagrasses. The seagrasses don't get enough light to grow. And then in turn, they die off and manatees don't have enough to eat. Then here on the left-hand side, we see a manatee that is being rescued for exposure to red tide. So effects on manatees from red tide can include seizures, drowning. The manatees may be lethargic, unresponsive. So this is really something to look out for, especially if you're living in an area that's experiencing a red tide. Usually those occur more so in the southwest of Florida, primarily in around Lee County, Sarasota County. However, this year we had a pretty prolonged red tide in the Tampa Bay and St. Petersburg area, and now in the Panhandle as well. So if you do see a manatee that's sort of twitching, lethargic, rolling around, and there is a red tide in the area, that's a good indication that the manatee is actually suffering from red tide exposure. Like I said, blue-green algae blooms, they can really block the seagrasses, causing die-offs, and then so-called dead zones where you really don't have anything growing underneath. And then last but not least, for threats, harassment is a really big issue, and a lot of people don't even really realize that what they're doing is considered harassment, which is basically anything that alters a manatee's natural behavior. So it is against the law to give food or water to manatees, and harassment can really alter behavior, separate mothers and calves, or it can even be fatal if manatees are chased out of their warm water sites by people, and then they have to face these colder surrounding temperatures. So that's why what we always recommend is passive observation, which means you're observing a manatee from a distance, letting it do its thing, and that's really the best way to observe these guys and not even get into trouble for accidentally harassing one of them. All right, so now let's go into the main part, which is really about how to spot a sick and injured manatee. And when we decided to set up this webinar, we said, it's Manatee Awareness Month right now. The manatees are coming back, and we've already had a really deadly year for manatees in Florida this year. So, so this would be a good way to tell people sort of what to look out for, and then if you see something, what are you going to do about it? How do you report it? So this presentation is pretty much focused on Florida. However, if you live in states like Georgia, North Carolina, Alabama, like those kind of states where we do have manatees seasonally, all the same things apply. You just wouldn't report them to the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission. You would be reporting them to local stranding networks. So that's sort of the only difference, but everything else applies, and it's the same thing. So the first thing you kind of want to look for is the manatee floating high in the water, or is it listing, is it listing to one side? Does it have trouble submerging? So with the manatee we're seeing here on the left-hand side, this guy, as you can see, it's floating high in the water, and this could potentially be a result of a boat strike and a pneumothorax where there is air in the lung cavity and the manatee just cannot submerge. It may try to dive down, and then it will sort of pop right back up like a cork almost. So if you see something like this is definitely something you would want to report. And then just as a comparison over here, I put a picture of a manatee mating herd. This is natural behavior and oftentimes can be observed in the spring and the summer months. They oftentimes go into very shallow areas. We see this in shallow coastal areas, usually one female here in the middle and a bunch of males pursuing her. Again, natural behavior, great to observe this from a distance, just not getting too close, but this is not something that we have to be concerned about. The next thing you want to look for is whether the manatee has any fresh or open wounds. So what you see here on the left-hand side is a manatee with very severe fresh propeller cuts. You can see those really deep lacerations, and they're sort of pink in color. And then here on the right-hand side, this is a healed scar pattern. So this is really not something to worry about. You would be more looking for this kind of injury. However, if you're not sure, it's always better to report it than let it go, and then the biologist can assess it. So if you're not sure, always better to report it. Oops, pointer going all over the place. There we go. Then sort of the most important thing, this may sound kind of funny, but you want to observe the breathing pattern. You want to see if the manatee is actually breathing rapidly. So manatees, they're mammals, so they do come up to the surface of the water to breathe. And they usually, what you see is just like these two little nostrils here. They stick them right out of the water, and then they'll exhale. So you hear sort of a sound, and then they inhale. So this is, considered one breath. They exhale, and then they inhale, and then go back down. So a healthy manatee will probably breathe every 2 to 5 minutes when they're active, and then they stay submerged for up to 20 minutes when they're resting or sleeping. So oftentimes when you report a manatee that you think is in distress, what the biologists will ask you is, can you measure its respiration rate? So, if you have a watch or your phone or something, it's a good idea to sort of measure how many times per 5 minutes or 10 minutes is the manatee breathing. So if it's breathing rapidly, maybe every 15 to 30 seconds while it's not really active, that can be a really good indication that something is wrong with that animal. So that's really the number one thing we're looking for every time we assess a manatee is the respiration rate. Now, like I said earlier, manatees at this time of year and throughout the winter months can become cold stressed. This is usually when they don't find that warm water source in time, or there's some other issue going on. And what that looks like is that they're usually really skinny. They're lethargic, so they don't move around a lot. They're not very responsive. They have these white lesions. They can be all over their body, but primarily on their snout, their flippers, and their tail. And again, they're usually breathing pretty rapidly. So this is definitely something that you would want to report, especially right now as we're going into the winter time. If any of you are out of state, if you're living, in like Georgia, the Carolinas, or further west, Alabama, Louisiana, this is really the time of year when manatees are supposed to migrate back to Florida. So any manatee sightings outside of Florida right now should all be reported to local stranding networks. This is really important because some manatees, with prolonged warm weather going into the fall and even going into early winter, they may still be out of state and then not really migrating back to Florida, what they should be doing. So, and then if we have a cold front and the water temperatures drop, they can really get trapped and get cold stress. So if I have anyone here listening right now who's out of state, definitely something to watch out for at this time of year. And then you also want to look to see if it's possibly an orphaned manatee. So manatee calves are usually with mom for the first 1 or 2 years of their lives. So if you see a really small manatee, like the one here in this picture, or the one in the middle here that was rescued, if you see them by themselves without any adult around, that's definitely something you want to call in, because these really tiny newborn manatees, they cannot survive on their own without a mom. Now here on the right-hand side is a picture of a manatee that has beached itself. Manatees are fully aquatic animals. They do not come out to bask like walruses or seals or sea lions do. So if you see a manatee that's stranded, that's tidally stranded, that is definitely something you want to report. It's not out there sunning itself. There's definitely something is wrong. You don't want to try to push that animal back into the water yourself. Number one, most likely it's beached itself for a reason. It's sick, it's exhausted, something is wrong. So the last thing you want to do is push it back to where it just came from. And then manatees are also, they're very docile animals, but they're extremely strong and heavy. An adult manatee can get over 2,000 pounds. So you really don't want to get too close to that animal and try to sort of push it back into the water yourself. If it scares and if it flops its tail, it can get really, really dangerous for anyone standing by. So this should really only be conducted by trained biologists who know how to handle a manatee. And even then, it can get a little dicey sometimes. So even for us, we got to be really careful. All right, so we've sort of established what to look for. If you see a manatee, you know what's normal, what's not. So what do you do now that you know that something is, not quite right? This is the number to call. I hope everyone is either way programming that into their phone right now, or considering to get like a little decal to put on their boat. This is the number you would want to call in Florida. This is a 24/7 hotline. So you can always call them and they will get you in touch with a biologist who can then assess the situation. If possible, try to stay with the manatee. That's sometimes easier said than done, because obviously manatees are swimming, they can swim away, but it's important to try to keep an eye on the manatee until the rescue crew can arrive. Like I said earlier, measuring its respiration, that's a really good thing to do, especially while you're waiting for a rescue crew to arrive. That's really important. That's something they're definitely going to be asking you for. And then if possible, taking a photo or video, however, without disturbing the manatee. So you want to make sure you're not getting too close trying to get a good video, and then at the same time scaring the manatee away, so that by the time the rescue crew comes, you have all these great photos, but the manatee's gone. And so you want to try to, if possible, get some pictures or video, but if not, it's more important to not stress out the manatee even more. So I put two pictures here on this slide. I'm going to go over this a bit more, but here you can see a manatee in a rescue stretcher. After it was rescued, it's put in the stretcher, and then people are carrying it to the rescue truck. And here you see two manatees just prior to release. They're sort of on these blue stretchers over here. All right, so how exactly does a rescue of a manatee work? Manatees are usually rescued with a large net, either way from land or from a specialized boat. So you can see this boat over here. It's open at the back, and the motor is going to be here in the front. And they have this specialized net, which has float lines on the top and lead lines on the bottom. So they try to encircle the manatee in the net and then pull it onto the boat. Obviously, again, it's way easier said than done. But this is usually how the manatee is then maneuvered onto the boat. After they caught the manatee is being put in a manatee rescue truck, which you can see here in the right-hand lower corner. Manatees can actually be out of the water for prolonged periods of time. They do not crush under their own weight. And since they breathe air, they don't actually have to be in water to be transported, which is that's a pretty convenient thing. So they are usually put into this rescue truck on really thick foam mats, and then they're sprayed down with water if it's to keep them comfortable, or in the winter time if it's a cold stress rescue, they're usually covered in blankets to keep them warm while they're being transported to a facility. As you can see here in the upper right hand corner, this is a manatee being treated at a facility, and they have these floors in the pool that sort of rise up so the staff can treat the manatee without having to drain the entire pool and take it out. So this is a very convenient way to treat these guys. So now, who all is involved in a manatee rescue? There we go. So this is definitely not a one-man show. The Manatee MRP, or Manatee Rescue and Rehabilitation Partnership, consists of a lot of different organizations. So Save the Manatee Club was a founding member, and we work in partnership with many different agencies, including U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission here in Florida, and a lot of ocean area, universities, research institutes. You can see it here, all of their logos are on the slide. But this is definitely not something that just one organization does. It's really a partnership where everyone is coming together to try to rescue and rehabilitate these manatees. So very big group effort, and a very strong partnership. So now I want to just listing a few ways for people to help. So one thing you can do, in addition to reporting sick and injured manatees, is assist researchers with sightings. So I will go into this into a bit more detail on the next slide, our sighting network. You can also make a donation to Save the Manatee Club or adopt a manatee, which is a really popular thing to do, especially right now around the holidays. We do have one of our adoptees, Millie. She is here in this picture. So we have over 30 manatees right now that are up for adoption, and the proceeds from the program then go towards our conservation efforts, which includes caring for rescue, rehab, and release, and supporting that partnership. You can also donate directly to the Manatee Rescue and Rehabilitation Partnership, the MRP, or you can donate through our site through the Emergency Rescue Fund as well. Like I said in a previous slide, we have free materials available for you to order. Those include those decals, BODA packets, signs, all those kind of things. And you can find that at savethemanatee.org/resources. Also, you can sign up for our newsletter and action alerts at the savethemanatee.org/signup. So we do send out bi-monthly e-newsletters, as well as any action alerts if we need the public's help with any manatee issues whatsoever. And then I just had to add this today. This is actually one of my favorite parts. Right now that manatee season is starting again, you can watch our manatee webcams live at manateev.org. Well, now it's dark out, so we're going to have some highlight streaming. But if you want to look tomorrow morning, manateev.org, they're going to be live from Homosassa as well as from Blue Spring. And now here's the sighting form, just to show you real quick. This is actually a way for you to report healthy manatees, so not sick and injured ones. But this is really helping researchers to sort of see where manatees are hanging out, what they're doing. This is providing a lot of really good data to see where these guys are hanging out, both inside and outside of Florida. And then this data is shared with the statewide Manatee Photo ID catalog, so those manatees can actually be matched. So the way this form works, you can record your the time of the sighting, the date, the location, the number of animals, as well as the manatee activity. So what are these manatees doing? Are they traveling or nursing or all those kind of things? And then this will be submitted to us, and we are sharing this with our partners. So again, you can find this form on savethemanatee.org/sightings. And again, just to re-emphasize, this form should not be used to report a sick and injured manatee. For those, you're going to call the FWC hotline because they are the biologists in charge of conducting the rescues. So this should only be used if you want to report healthy-looking manatees. All right, and this brings me to the end of my talk. So I'm going to open it up for any questions. If anyone has a question to put in the Q&A or in the chat, and I'm going to have, I guess, Kim and Tiare sort of monitor that and see if anybody has any questions for me.
So we have our first question. I don't know why I'm reverberating, but should you provide shade from the hot sun if the manatees are beached?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So usually what you're going to do, you're going to call the FWC number first, and they will instruct you exactly what to do. So providing shade is most of the time that's definitely appropriate. So if you have like, some people have like a pop-up tent or something at the beach, or, an umbrella or something, that's a really good way to keep the manatee shaded. Sometimes putting like wet towels over them, that's a way to do as well. But that's something, you want to call the FWC and they will instruct you on what to do. So just because I said wet towels is a great idea, I don't want anyone to go out there and just throw some wet towels on the manatee and think, situation is solved kind of thing. So usually they instruct you on what they want you to do. Manatees can't really get sunburned as such, but they can definitely dehydrate or become distressed if they're out in the heat for too long, especially if they're beached or stranded. So that's a great question. Definitely providing shade for these guys is a good, that's a good effort.
Okay, and then I have a question about the water temperature again. That's a problem for manatees.
Yeah, so sort of what we say the magic number, so to speak, is 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Which translates into 20 degrees Celsius. So that's usually the time when that's usually the temperature when that manatees, where they go back to their warm water sites. Now, that doesn't mean that they cannot go out into that water at all. They can just not spend prolonged periods of time in water colder than 68 degrees. So right now, for example, the St. John's River dipped down to, I believe it was 64, 65 last week. We still had manatees in the St. John's River. They just have to come into the spring to stay warm, and then they're going out into the river to feed. So it's not a huge issue for them if it's, in the 60s, but once it drops into the 50s, they really need to sort of be at that warm water side, and they can't really tolerate temperatures below that for long times.
And then are GPS coordinates helpful to provide to wildlife officials?
Yes, absolutely. So, and that goes back to sort of what I said about, keeping an eye on manatees. It's oftentimes very difficult to keep an eye on them or to describe an exact location, especially if you're like out on your boat. I mean, you may just know you're in a lake or you're, somewhere out in the ocean, but it's always a good idea to provide exact coordinates to the biologists, as well as our sighting form, I believe, and Tiare can correct me if I'm wrong, because she was the one who set all of this up. I think there's a field to put your GPS coordinates in there to report a sighting, which is really important, but Tiare can probably talk a bit more about that aspect of the sighting form.
Thank you, Cora. Yes, so we are reworking our sighting form. It hasn't been published on our website yet. It's coming in the next few days. So that the new form will be electronic, and when you fill it out, you can put in the exact location. You can pinpoint it on a map exactly where you saw the animals. So if that's a little offshore or in a canal, or say it's you don't say that you would typically go home and fill it out, you can actually fill it out on your phone and put it in the location when you're out wherever you are and fill it out right then, so that we have the location, which will be really useful because we'll be able to use that for future studies if we want to see where the animals are going. If there isn't data for an area already, some areas aren't in the surveys, and we know there's manatees there. We've gotten pictures, we know they're there, but there isn't any data that says it. So when you guys say that you saw a manatee in your area and we get that data, we're able to say for sure that there are manatees there.
Yeah, going back to the GPS coordinates too, I know I talked about sick and injured manatees, but the same applies to if you see a dead manatee. So all dead manatees should be reported as well, and it's really important to give GPS coordinates for that too, especially if you cannot stay with the carcass. Unfortunately, some of these carcasses, they float, especially if they're like in a waterway, like a river or something. So having exact coordinates instead of just saying I saw a deceased manatee in the St. John's River, it's really important to have that exact location, because that really helps biologists to sort of at least get an idea of where it was seen, so that they can hopefully respond to that and know exactly where to look.
Cora, I would like to follow up on that. I'd like to remind our guests to please type your questions in the Q&A feature. We see the questions coming in the chat, but then they all go right over each other. As far as uploading photos and videos to the sighting forum, yes, you can upload photos. There is a size limit for video. So another thing you can do is you can post it to YouTube unlisted and send us the link. The new form that is coming out soon will have more options to upload video. And you can also send it to the conservation at savethemanatee.org email address, or through our website if you'd like to upload things that way as well, if you don't upload them with the form when you submit it.
And we do have a question in the Q&A, and this is a good one. The Tico plant is converting to natural gas. Will it continue to produce hot water?
So I'm going to try to answer that. I do know that every power plant right now that does have manatees there, that they have they're part of manatee protection plans. They're part of having to provide that warm water to manatees. So for example, a power plant can't just decide from one winter to the next to just go offline and then there's no more warm water. So they're definitely they definitely do have to provide that warm water, but I'm not entirely sure what going into the future, what the requirements are. I don't know if maybe Kim can talk a bit more to that, because I know there's a lot of argumentation going on, a discussion going on about what to do in the future and how to sort of provide that warm water habitat for them, especially for manatees that just use those artificial sources right now, that don't use the natural springs. So I don't know if Kim, if you have any more sort of input to that particular question.
That was a good response. The Tico plant, like Cora said, all of the power plants do have to have this contingency plan, and they can't just cut it off. I don't know what the time frame is. I know that there are a number of power plants that are intending to provide that warm water into the foreseeable future. And I don't know if that's as part of the new operations, because they still will be discharging that warm water, or if it's because of this manatee protection plan that they had to put together.
All right, let's see, were there any more questions in the chat? I thought I saw some going in. Let's see.
Yes, there are. Are there many manatees near Bonita Springs around Christmas time?
That's a good question. I do know, I feel the closest to Bonita Springs, where you can probably expect to see manatees when it's cold, is Manatee Park in Fort Myers. I think it's called Lee County Manatee Park, and it's in Fort Myers. It's right by a power plant. So usually when the water temperatures drop, manatees will migrate there. They also, like we just mentioned, they come to the Tico power plant in Apollo Beach, which that's a little further north of Bonita Springs. That's not right there. But I do know that there's some, kayaking operations down there who do, eco-friendly kayak with manatee tours. So they will probably know better where to exactly find manatees there around that time. I know there's some in Estero Bay and the Caloosahatchee River, but it depends on the time of year, and it really depends on the temperature. So that's really something to keep in mind, is that it's kind of a little unforeseeable, when it's cold and when it's warm. I usually tell people, the best time to see manatees at these warm water sites is in January. However, if we have a really warm January and we have a whole week of temperatures that are in the 80s or something, there may really not be a ton of manatees at these warm water sites. So you really got to watch the temperature. And usually manatees come to these warm water sites about 2 to 3 days after a cold front has moved through, because that's how long it takes the water to really cool down and bring those manatees in. So that's usually how it works, but it depends on the area too. So it may not get as cold in Southwest Florida as it gets up here in the north central portion of the state, but that sort of would be my answer to that.
And then can I post a sign or decal near my home, or do I need permission from the city of Miami?
So that's a good question. I think I can start off with that. As far as I know, if you own the property, you can post signs, on it. I mean, if you have like a dock or like a waterfront property, you should be able to do that. Now, if you're trying to put it on city property, I would think that you need the permission from whoever, owns that property, whether it's the city of Miami or the county, but maybe Kim can talk a bit to that as well. That's what I mean. If you have a specific location in mind that you would like signs for, you can definitely contact us, and we can see too if that's private property or if that's who owns that property to put the signage up there.
On that note, Florida has a pretty liberal sign law. And we do try to make sure that the signs are going waterward. So we don't necessarily want to distribute signs to be placed on like a roadside or anything like that. So if you live on the water, I've never heard of anyone having a difficulty putting it on private property. If you live on in an HOA, I would definitely recommend checking to make sure, but you should be protected with your private property rights. And then, we had a question and an answer. How many manatees live in the Miami Brickell Bay area?
Ooh, well, that's a good question. Honestly, I have to say I don't have the exact numbers for that. I mean, I do know there's quite a few manatees that are down in the Miami and Fort Lauderdale area. How many exactly, like in terms of numbers, are in the Brickell area? I'm not entirely sure. I know in the wintertime they're really using the Fort Lauderdale power plant as well as the Port Everglades power plant. But I'm not super familiar with how many exactly are in that area. I don't know if Kim and Tiara have any estimates on that.
So I lived around there for about a year, and they don't have an exact number according to anything I've read about how many manatees are in the area. There are definitely more manatees during the winter in the canals near the power plants, but the manatees that are there, they're pretty transient in that they are constantly moving around for food versus resting. They'll go all the way across the bay and back. So there's no guarantee that you'll see them in one particular area, especially during the summer, because they go all over the place. And that coast population, the East Coast, they travel pretty far just in general as compared to some of the other. There's regions of the animals, and the East Coast region, they travel pretty far. So to say that there are manatees there, but if there isn't one group that stays there all of the time, if that's kind of the question you're asking. As far as the total number, it's kind of hard to say for that reason.
Well, I do want to go back to that question. Fish and Wildlife Commission does have a lot of data available online. So they do these synoptic surveys that Cora mentioned yearly. And so you can kind of go online. I'm going to put in the chat their interactive map. You can kind of search around there and get an idea of how many are being observed during those surveys. Hopefully I'll give you the correct link in this chat here. And then the recording will be available after the presentation. And then I think the next question we have is, we live on the Loxahatchee. All of our seagrass has died. We replanted. The manatees are so hungry. They are coming up on our beach to eat the grass.
So this is a kind of a complex topic. I can start this off, and then maybe Kim and Tiara can help me a bit with this answer. So there's definitely efforts ongoing to replant seagrasses, as well as doing living shoreline restoration, as oyster restoration, clam restoration, because what we really do need to keep in mind is that it's not that easy to just replant the seagrasses. If we have a polluted system, by nutrients that are from, coming from fertilizer, runoff, septic tanks, all those kind of things, we're dealing with a really severe water quality issue. So it's really difficult to plant grasses into this polluted system and then just expect them to grow. So unfortunately, this was a problem that was literally decades in the making. And now we're facing a situation where it's literally a marathon and not a sprint. I mean, even if we start replanting, this can take literally years to grow. So cleaning up the water quality is really the number one thing that needs to be done before planting can occur. Now, like I said earlier, manatees, they do eat a large variety of plants. They don't just eat seagrasses or submerged aquatic grasses. They also eat a lot of floating plants, a lot of floating vegetation. So some of the things that we're working on is trying to protect areas where that kind of vegetation is available to those manatees, so they can feed on that. And then just a quick note, manatees, they are extremely curious animals. So sometimes literally if they see something that they feel they can get to and they want to eat it, they will try it. I mean, we have seen manatees at Blue Spring, which I always use that as an example because I do most of my work. We have really seen them lifting themselves halfway out of the water to get like a little branch on the tree or to get a piece of low-hanging Spanish moss. I mean, Spanish moss is probably really not the most nutritious and tasty thing for them to eat, but they see it and they're going to go up there and they eat it. So by them coming sort of out of the water and eating on the lawn, sometimes it's literally just out of curiosity or because the water levels are higher than they were before and suddenly they can access this. So they're like, oh yeah, great, I'm going to try that. But I can definitely see how on the East Coast, you know, manatees, they're going to try to feed whatever they can find. So I don't know if Kim and Tiara have, you know, anything to add to the whole, you know, feeding.
Yeah, I would add that if you do live on a canal, we recommend that you don't spray your lawn. I mean, just in general, we recommend it, but we especially recommend that you don't spray your lawn or your plants or anything close to the canal with pesticides, because the manatees will and can and will go up to the edge of your lawn and eat whatever is there. Same thing with not cutting any native vegetation. If you happen to live in an area where you get native plants that grow on the bank and you usually trim them, especially this winter, if you can leave that behind so manatees will have something to eat, especially if the seagrass is gone in your area. Anything we can do to provide for the animals. Kim, would you like to add to that?
No, I think that's great advice. Those low maintenance zones around your canal or water bodies are really important to maintain or to try to maintain as little as possible.
Yeah, the opposite of maintain
Right.
for the manatees.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that goes back to also what we said earlier. A lot of the nutrient pollution is caused by things like leaking septic tanks or fertilizers and those kind of things. So if you're living near a waterway, near a canal, or even if you don't necessarily live right next to a waterway, trying to really cut down on the amount of fertilizer that you're using. If you absolutely have to use fertilizer, don't use it during the rainy season where literally there's a rainstorm and all your fertilizer and all those nutrients wash right off into the waterways. You know, that's something that, you know, everyone can do to try to not overload the system with even more nutrients. If you have, you know, if you can plant Florida-friendly plants that don't need any fertilizer, that don't even need any additional irrigation, you know, that's another thing you can do to help. If you have the opportunity to convert from septic to sewer, you know, or get your septic tanks inspected to make sure they're working well, they're not leaking into the waterways. If you have the opportunity to plant, to convert from like a seawall to a living shoreline where you have mangroves or plants along the shoreline instead of having that concrete seawall. So those are all kind of things that people can do, not necessarily to replant the grasses right away, but to try to restore the water quality so that then grasses that are replanted actually have the opportunity to grow.
It's also worth noting that seagrasses and some other aquatic plants during the colder months, they go dormant. So they, as far as they don't continue to grow and they start to come back in the spring. So we can see some regrowth in these areas, but this is not the time for that. So even if we were to plant, it's not the growing season. So it's not like the best time for something like that, but just to keep that in mind. And I don't see any other questions.
I think we have about 5 minutes left. So if anyone has any last minute questions, you can post them in the chat or the Q&A box, and we will make this recording available on our website. So if you want to rewatch it, or if you have people who were not able to join us, that will be available on our website as well.
And if you have questions that you think of after the presentation, please email us and ask those questions and we'll get back to you.
Thank you all for attending. We really appreciate it. Let's get to see some manatees this winter.
See, there was one question coming in, I think it was Ariana, about trash cleanups. So we have organized some trash cleanups in the past, and we also collaborate with a lot of partners who do cleanups all around the state. We do have partnered with Keep Brevard Beautiful, that's in Brevard County. We have partnered with some groups in Miami. So we usually post these events on our website and our social media as well. So no matter what area you live in, there's a lot of local areas that do trash pickup, cleanup events, and those are really important too, because we really want to try to get that trash out of the environment. So we don't have any scheduled currently. We do actually have one coming up over at Blue Springs State Park. I think it's on December 11th, but you can find it on our website, and it has that information on there as well. So
we have a question about manatee adoptions. Is there a way to purchase pictures of our adoptees on our website?
Yeah, we definitely have pictures of our adoptees, and we can definitely send them to you. We do always post them in our newsletters and our, on our social media and our website. But if you want to email us directly, then we can certainly provide some photos of your adoptee. I see you've adopted Gator. We actually just saw him this morning at Blue Spring. So we can definitely provide some pictures. Yes.
Thank you all for taking the time to listen. Yes, we're typing our emails into the chat.
Yes, good idea.
And if you have if you're interested in having presentations at your organization or anything like that, we have an education department, a conservation department, and all that information is on our website if you'd like to email specific people, specific questions.
We do have one about the restoration project on Homosassa River. Will it be ongoing? Oh, there you go.
I don't know, Kim, do you know anything particularly about this one?
I do not know about this one, but Cheryl, I think we have your email address, so I'll dig into that a little bit more. We can gather up some information. Do you have some more information you can provide us in the chat?
I mean, I know that there was some you're planting food for manatees. I mean, there was definitely a project that had, was going on in Crystal River where they replanted the eelgrass, and I believe I heard about similar projects being done in the Homosassa River, but I don't have the exact details on that, so I don't want to say anything right now that may not be the case. But I know our executive director, Patrick Rose, will definitely have the answer to that, and we can certainly follow up on that. So like Kim said, we have your email address, so we definitely look into that. I just don't know off the top of my head when this is going to be going on and like what the current status is on it. I have to say I'm not sure.
Thanks, Pat, for your response in the chat. I was going to say we're lucky that area tends to have a good group that are on top of the restoration in that area. It seems like there's always something going on, but without a specific name of who exactly is doing it, we can't point to a specific direction.
Well, thanks everyone for attending. And if anyone has any questions, we put our emails in the chat. So you guys can email us directly as well.
All right. Good night, everybody. Thanks again.
Thank you for coming and listening to our presentation. Have a great rest of your night, everyone.